Last time we stopped around the middle of room 3. Since the level has 5 rooms total, we're about halfway through the build. Now the goal is to finish the first full pass. During testing, I noticed this platform section feels a bit awkward. You can still move through it, but being this close to the wall makes the gameplay feel cramped. I'm also thinking ahead to the falling blocks planned for this section. Since they'll drop onto this catwalk area, the space feels too tight for the block size I want to use. So I'm going to grab these narrow platforms and shift them 1 meter farther from the wall to open things up a bit. After testing the section again, the movement already feels much better. By starting the playtest here, we can skip the first 2 rooms and jump straight into this area. Now when we run across the platforms, there's more breathing room, so it doesn't feel awkwardly close to the wall anymore. It also gives enough space for the falling block to pass through cleanly without hitting the side wall. Another important thing to test is whether the player can actually fall through this gap. If the character can't fit, then the opening serves no gameplay purpose and becomes purely decorative. Thankfully, the gap works as a real hazard. The only issue right now is that falling through it sends the player endlessly downward, which isn't what we want for the final game. Eventually, the game would probably stop the player after falling far enough outside the map, but for now, the character just keeps dropping forever. So I'll exit the test here. Since the camera is now way below the level, the quickest way back up is to select one of the mesh pieces we placed earlier. It doesn't matter which mesh you choose, just select any piece and press F on the keyboard to frame it. That instantly moves the camera back to your level. So if you ever get lost far away from the map, this is the fastest way to return. Simply select an object and tap F. Let's keep going. It looks like the 1x4 floor pieces disappeared from the level, probably because they were dragged out from the content browser earlier. So I'll place those back into room 3 first. After that, I'll run another quick test. At this point, the catwalk section has been moved 1 meter farther from the wall, so I want to see how the updated spacing feels in gameplay. I might move these platforms outward too, but for this section I actually want the player closer to the wall. The plan here is to have fire hazards blast sideways out from it. The final spacing really depends on how large we want those fire effects to be and how far their damage area should reach. You could move this section out by another meter too. Just keep in mind that the fire traps or whatever hazards you place here may need a longer reach so they still cover the walkway properly. That's something to consider later, but for now let's keep moving and finish this pass. Just like we did in room 2, we also need to lower these walls a bit more. I'll start by selecting this object and holding Alt to duplicate it. One thing to watch out for, if you try to duplicate but don't click directly on the gizmo, the camera can suddenly rotate in an unexpected way. That usually just means the click landed slightly off target. It's not an error, just a small input mismatch, and you can continue normally once you try again. If the camera ends up drifting too far again, just press F to frame your selection and snap back into view. There's also a small Z-fighting issue here because the catwalk overlaps with this piece. Whether that becomes a problem depends on how your final assets are set up and how clean the geometry ends up being. For now, I'll lower these pieces back down by 10. It does throw off the alignment a bit, but that's fine for a prototype. There are ways to clean this up later when we do a second pass. I'll switch my grid back to the 800 increment to stay consistent, then use the open bracket key to nudge everything down in steps of 10. In a real production setup, especially working with a professional artist, these floor pieces usually wouldn't have full thickness. They'd often just be simple top surfaces instead. It really depends on the level's design, but in many cases the underside of the floor wouldn't even exist in the final version. So if that's the direction you're going for, it's important to place everything with that in mind from the start. If the top strip and the side weren't solid faces, this overlap issue wouldn't happen at all. They'd align cleanly without any visual conflict. Still, for now I find it a bit distracting, so I'm just going to lower it slightly. I'll move underneath to get a clearer view and make sure everything is properly lined up. Down 10 over 1, then down 1 more and back up to 100 over again. That should line things up properly. If you want, you can fully enclose both sides with walls here. That's totally valid. For my version though, I think I'll leave it open and maybe use a support pillar instead. It felt a bit too enclosed otherwise. I tested it with the walls, but having that tight narrow gap enclosed on both sides felt a bit awkward. It also made it harder to move around and properly see what I was doing while lining everything up. So for now, I'm going to leave it open and move on to building the ceiling for this pass instead. Before we continue, I'll set things up properly in the folder structure. I'll create a new subfolder called Ceiling 3 and move this piece into it. From here on, it's really the same workflow repeated until the full level is built. I can also see we're slightly off again by about 10 centimeters, nothing unusual. That kind of small drift can happen during placement. It looks like the issue comes from this section needing to be shifted over by about 10, along with the whole wall. If you ever need to adjust or even temporarily hide entire wall sections like this, you can treat them the same way as the ceilings. Just organize them into a separate folder, something like Room 3 Wall South or whatever naming system works best for you. You'd handle it exactly the same way we did with the ceilings. I've also kept all the rooms square on purpose, since it makes working with the grid much simpler during building. That said, square layouts aren't always the most visually interesting. They can feel a bit plain, and there are plenty of ways to break that up later to make the level more varied and engaging. That said, for this course, the goal isn't to build a perfectly polished level. It's really about learning the fundamentals, so I'm not too focused on making this the most impressive design right now. Later on, we'll come back in a second pass and refine things to make the level look and feel more visually interesting. That's pretty solid for Room 3. I've also added a few work lights, but again, these are just temporary and not part of the final lighting setup. When we play from here, the player enters the room and quickly realizes the gap is too wide to jump, so something else is needed. The catwalk now guides them across, and later we'll come back in and place traps along these sections. That's a solid first pass for Room 3. Now let's move on to the floor layout. Checking the plan, we'll drop down by 1 unit. All of these hallways are designed as single grid squares to keep things simple. From there, we move down 1 unit and extend the layout out 1, 2, 3 blocks downward. Let's duplicate this piece out. I'll collapse the outliner so it's easier to see what I'm working on. Now I'll move the point lights we just added into Room 3. If I create a new folder, no worries if the World Settings tab accidentally pops up. That just happens sometimes and it can be closed. Next, I'll select everything and set up a new folder for Room 4 in the outliner to keep things organized. Since we know we'll need it anyway, I'll go ahead and set up the Room 4 ceiling now. I'll also move the selected floor piece into Room 4. Just to keep the layout clear, we're working on a simple grid, 1, 2, 3 units forward, then it extends out by 2 more before reaching the pit. That gives us a 2-wide section right here. I'll undo that last change since I missed a small detail. We didn't actually create the hallway yet. Let's fix that first. This piece should stay in Room 3, not Room 4. That's because I'm treating these transition corridors as part of the previous room in my setup, so the organization stays consistent. And that's really just a design choice I made. There's no strict rule saying this hallway has to belong to Room 3 instead of Room 4. It just needed a place to sit logically in the structure. Now I can see we're off again by about 10 centimeters on this side. The whole ceiling section is slightly shifted, and it's easy to spot because it no longer aligns cleanly with the grid. Selecting everything manually would be a bit tedious here. Luckily, everything is already grouped under the Room 3 ceiling folder, so I can just grab the whole set at once. I'll include this piece as well since I already moved it and it ended up offset by 10. That makes it a quick fix. It's another good example of why keeping your outliner organized with proper folders really helps speed things up and avoid mistakes. Alright, everything looks like it's in the right place now. Room 4 is still empty at this stage, which is exactly what we want for now. Now we can move on and actually build Room 4. From this point, the layout goes 1, 2, 3 units down, then 3 units across until we hit the pit. I'll select these pieces and move them into Room 4, then hide the previous section so I can keep working cleanly. Now we've got the start of Room 4 and the beginning of the pit laid out. Looking at the structure, the pit is 4 units wide. That means the surrounding walls also need to extend at least that far to properly frame it. I'll measure it by extending this wall out step by step 1, 2, 3, 4 units. That way, when I duplicate the next piece, I know it will land in the correct position. So the 5th point lines up with where the floor begins. From there, I can continue extending it down by 3 more units to complete the section. I'll do the same thing with this wall, grabbing 2 pieces at a time to speed things up. 1, then 2, and I'll make sure the pit edges are properly supported since the walls need to carry that boundary too. And if you're wondering why everything keeps ending up off by 10, it usually comes down to small grid misalignments or snapping not being perfectly consistent during placement. A lot of the time, it comes down to pivot placement on the wall pieces. In this case, the pivot isn't centered, it's sitting on one edge. That was intentional so each side lines up cleanly with the grid. But it also means that when I rotate a piece, I need to rotate it a full 180 degrees to keep everything aligned correctly. And I'm not always doing that consistently, which is why I sometimes end up off by 10 and have to go back and fix it. If I ever lose my view again, I can just press F to refocus and bring the scene back. Now back to the pit. Before finishing this room, I need to test its width. Clearly, this gap isn't meant to be jumped in a single move. The gap is definitely too wide to cross in one jump, so I'll need to add a few smaller platforms in between. To test this properly, I'm going to create a new piece. I could just add a fresh block and scale it, but it's quicker to reuse these existing 4 pieces since they're already at the correct height. Just like we did for the floor and the catwalk, I'll switch into modeling mode and duplicate this piece. Next, I'll scale it down slightly. I'm keeping snapping enabled so everything stays aligned and consistent. A 3x3 size feels like a good starting point for these platforms. When it comes to these platforms, I didn't really draw them to exact scale in the original layout, and honestly, that's something I probably should have done. But in practice, you often just work with what you have. You might not even have a fully precise level map to begin with, and that's fine. The main point is that it's okay to adjust and deviate from the plan once you're actually testing the gameplay and seeing what feels right in real time. If I had made these to proper scale on the map, they'd be about 1x1 units, basically a 1 square meter platform. But in actual gameplay, that would be extremely difficult to land on. Imagine trying to play a platformer and consistently jumping onto something that's small. It would feel almost impossible. So I'm going to move away from the strict map scale here. And honestly, you probably should too, unless you're very precise with top-down level planning. Not everything, especially if you're still learning level design, will translate perfectly from a 2D plan into a 3D space. Once you actually build it, things can feel very different from how they looked on paper. And realistically, if you were already that accurate with your level maps, you probably wouldn't need this course in the first place. So now I'll go ahead and extend this section out. I think a 3x3 size will work well here. It already feels much more reasonable for a player to run and jump onto during gameplay. So I'll keep them at this scale. The trade-off is that since these platforms are larger, we won't be able to fit as many of them into the same space. For example, we definitely can't squeeze in 5 like we originally imagined. We could technically fit 5 here, but they'd be packed so tightly together that it wouldn't really feel like a platforming challenge anymore. So I'll reduce it down to 3 platforms and test that layout instead. On first try, that initial platform feels a bit too close, almost like you could accidentally overshoot it without even trying. That one works fine, and this really comes down to your level design goals. If you don't care about the exact path the player takes, then it's okay if these platforms are close enough that they can be skipped or jumped between in different ways. But if you want the player to engage with every platform, then you need to space them far enough apart so they can't just skip from one directly to another. Then we'd have to leapfrog across to the next one first. Right now it's technically doable, but this platform still feels a bit too close to the edge. It's easy to accidentally skip past it entirely. So I'll right-click and play from here to test it properly. After moving it out by just 1 meter, the spacing already feels a lot better. That feels good overall, and this last jump works fine as well. The floor will extend out anyway, so I'm not too concerned about the distance from this point to the next section, or at least not for now. One last thing I want to check is whether the player can skip this section. Right now, it looks like you can make the jump in 2 moves instead of using all the platforms. I don't think I want that. I want the player to actually use this 3rd platform here. Of course, there are many different ways you could design a section like this, depending on the experience you want. Again, you could design it so these two platforms are reachable in a single jump, and then place something optional off to the side like a pickup, a collectible, or a treasure chest to encourage players to leave the main path. But for this setup, I'm just going to select the whole section and adjust it as needed. I'm going to extend this pit by 4 meters, 1, 2, 3, 4. That just gives us a bit more room to work with and lets us space the platforms out more cleanly. It also adds a small bit of challenge without making things feel punishing, especially since this is still a tutorial level. I just want a little extra space here so the layout feels better balanced. I think something like that works. Right now, we're about 3 meters from the edge here and roughly 4 meters on this side. So I'm going to even that out and extend the spacing a bit. When I test it in play mode, the most natural jump distance feels like it sits around 4 to 5 meters between platforms. Ultimately, it comes down to how you want the game to feel. The key is making sure everything you ask the player to do is actually achievable. At the same time, you don't want it to be so difficult that players get frustrated and quit, even if it is technically possible. If you're only just barely clearing jumps, like by a tiny margin, that usually isn't enough space. Even if it is technically possible after repeated testing, it can still feel unfair in practice. That's one of the challenges when playtesting your own game. You end up getting very good at it just from repetition, and that can make it harder to judge what's actually a fair difficulty for a new player. Okay, we've got the platforms placed out here, but they're still snapping relative to this floor, so we need to correct that. Before I fix the positioning, I'm going to adjust these down. I don't want them looking like they're floating, I want them to feel like they're actually emerging from the floor. So I'll extend them down to about 4 meters in height, since that matches the rest of the level's vertical scale. And that just helps keep everything consistent. I'm using the markings on this material to measure it out so I can set the height to 4 meters, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is exactly why the grid material is so useful for blocking things out quickly and accurately. So now each platform is basically a 3 by 3 by 4 block, which will be our standard jumping platform going forward. Same process here, we just need to make a new reference for this platform. I'll go into modeling mode and use mesh duplicate, then rename it to something like platform 3 meter so it stays clear and organized. I'll keep everything else the same except for the scaling adjustments. Because of how it was resized, the normals ended up flipped, which is why the box looks inverted. So I actually need to redo this part. I'll delete this version and rebuild it properly so it's clear what went wrong. This happened because when I scaled it to reach the 4 meter height, I scaled it in the wrong direction instead of adjusting it correctly. Once it hit that inversion point, the mesh flipped, which caused the normals to turn inside out. That's why the surface is now displaying incorrectly. I'm not going to go too deep into normals right now, especially if you're not familiar with them yet. We'll properly cover that later when we get into creating art assets. For now, the main thing to remember is simple. Scale it upward, not downward, to avoid this issue. I'm going to delete this platform since it's no longer correct. Now we're left with our proper 3 by 3 by 4 setup. It is currently floating in the air, but we'll fix the positioning in a moment. I'll duplicate the mesh using the mesh duplicate tool and rename it to platform 3 meter. At first, it may still look like it's showing a 4x4, but that's expected. We just need to fix the transform data. So I'll reset the scale by breaking it just like before. Then I'll go into the transform settings and clear out the scale values so everything updates correctly. I don't think leaving rotation checked actually affects this since I didn't rotate the mesh, but I'll uncheck it anyway just to stay consistent with the workflow. Now I'll hit accept and the platform displays correctly in the static mesh view. Finally, I'll press F2 and clean up the name by removing the extra random string. You can turn off the random naming string if you want, and I covered that in earlier videos, but I usually leave it on as a safety fallback. Now I actually want to adjust the pivot point. I don't want it sitting at the bottom of the mesh anymore. Instead, I want the pivot aligned to the top of the platform since that's the part I'm using to judge placement and spacing. So I'll go into pivot editing mode and make sure snapping is enabled. From here, I can move the pivot up, but it looks like the snap settings got a bit off, so I'll correct that first. Then I'll snap the pivot to the top face so it locks in properly. After that, I'll adjust it into position so it sits exactly where the top of the platform is. Now the pivot is sitting at the top corner, so I'll hit accept. From here, I can position it properly, 1, 2, 3, 4 units, then down into place. To double-check alignment, I can use Control to snap it to the nearest grid point. If anything is slightly off, that will automatically pull it back into perfect alignment based on the grid size. Right, so if I snap it while it's aligned to the 100 grid, it'll snap to the nearest 100 unit increment. But if I switch it to a smaller grid like 10, then it only snaps to the nearest 10 units instead. You can see how that gives much finer control over placement. I think I covered this earlier as well, but it's a useful reminder. Just as a quick reminder, I'll switch snapping back to the 100 grid so it's easier to get everything roughly in place. Now I'll move it back to where it was originally. We had it at about 3 meters out, but that felt a bit too tight, so I'll push it to 4 meters instead for better spacing. Next, I'll hold Alt and select that corner to duplicate it along both the X and Y directions, keeping it locked on the same Z height so it stays level. I'll move this piece out into position and delete the extra one. Then I'll bring this platform back to roughly where it was intended to sit. It's not perfectly exact, but it's close enough for now. Before moving on, I'll quickly test the spacing again. I just want to confirm the jumps still feel consistent and, importantly, that the player can actually make it across without any issues. And that looks good, we can still traverse it comfortably. Alright, let's reorient using the plan. We've got 2 units in this direction before we reach the gate, and the first section is already in place. Now I'll extend the second section to match that layout. Before continuing, I'll also make sure everything is properly organized into the correct folders so we don't run into any issues later. Now I'll continue building it out, 1, 2. And that should line up correctly, so we come in 1 unit, then the hallway starts, and then 2 units after that. Now I just need to repeat the same process for the ceilings and duplicate everything across. I'll move this piece out, then quickly check the first section to make sure it's still aligned properly. It looks correct so far. I'll place this piece into ceiling 4, then start duplicating the rest of the ceiling elements across. Snapping looks stable and everything is staying nicely aligned, so the structure is holding together correctly. The final step for this room is lighting. I'll add a few temporary work lights so we can actually see the space clearly while we keep building. These lights also have adjustable settings like color and intensity, but for now they're just temporary work lights so I can see what I'm doing while testing the level. I'm not focused on mood or lighting design yet, that will come later. Right now, it's just about visibility while building. This recording is getting a bit long, but I just want to quickly finish this last small room before we wrap things up. This one is very simple, a basic square room. No traps, no platforms, nothing extra in it right now. So I'll go ahead and build it out. It looks like this final room is a simple 3x3 layout. So I'll start by creating a room 5 folder and move the point lights from room 4 into it so everything stays organized. Then I'll set up a new subfolder for the ceilings since we'll definitely need that. After that, I'll move this piece in and lay it out as a basic 3x3 space for room 5. Pretty simple, just a 3x3 space as we move into room 5. So I'll set it up accordingly and move into room 5. The ceiling pieces for the previous room look like they're snapping correctly and the floor grid is lining up as expected, so everything is still consistent. Last thing for this room is lighting. I'll drop in a single light and just leave it floating in the center for now so we can see what we're doing while we test the layout. I'll hit save here. This saves the level and also any unsaved changes in the content browser. If you ever notice a small asterisk next to an asset, that simply means it hasn't been saved yet and still has pending changes. If Unreal were to crash, anything with that asterisk wouldn't be preserved, so it's important to save regularly and often. You can also save just the level itself. Even if you haven't added new assets but you've moved or placed objects in the scene, you can store the current layout by using the Save Current Level option up here. Alright, this is our final goal room. Before wrapping up, the last thing I want to do is run a full playtest from start to finish. So I'll hit play at the top and start from the player's start. This will give us our scale reference and let us see the entire level in motion. The character is still in place, so I'll run through the full test. First jump, clean and easy to clear. We land on the catwalk next, and it's simple to run across without any risk of falling. Same idea in the following section. This final room is the most challenging part to navigate, which makes sense since the difficulty is meant to build up as we move from room to room. And from there, we clear it and reach the final section of the level. So we've now tested the full level and everything is currently possible to complete. That gives us a solid first pass for the prototype. But while running through it, you've probably noticed it still feels pretty plain. That's expected at this stage. Next, we'll do a second pass on the prototype to add more variety and make the level a bit more interesting and engaging. And that's what we'll tackle next when we come back. I'll see you in the next video.